My name is Grace Turner. I'm 34 years old, and 2 hours after we buried my dad, my sister tried to erase me with a clipboard and a DNA test. We were still in the side room of the funeral home, flowers wilting in the corner, when she stepped into my space so close I could smell her perfume and hissed, "You're nothing like Dad. Take a DNA test or forget about inheriting anything." She didn't lower her voice. The lawyer shifted in his chair. My mother stared at the carpet, and the room went dead quiet. I've heard some version of that line my whole life. My sister is taller, blonder, the one everyone said was Dad's twin. I'm the one who got Mom's dark hair, dark eyes, and all the whispered comparisons that came with them. But instead of defending myself or crying like she clearly expected, I just looked at the consent form she'd shoved across the table. My hands weren't even shaking. I picked up the pen, signed my name, and slid it back. "Oh, fine," I said, calm enough that even the lawyer looked up. "You're going to regret this." Her smile flickered for half a second, then she laughed under her breath. "Never." She thought a lab report would cut me clean out of my own father's life, like I was some clerical error that needed correcting. What she didn't know was that my dad had already seen this coming, and he'd left more than a few surprises behind. If you've ever had family turn on you the second money hits the table, stay with me, because my sister's little DNA test didn't just backfire, it took her entire world down with it. Arthur Blake, my dad's estate attorney, called me the next morning and asked if I could start going through Dad's place on the lake, the house everyone in the family treated like a vacation postcard instead of the thing he'd worked 30 years for. So that afternoon, I drove out of Chicago toward the North Shore, my little Honda humming along the highway, while I replayed my sister's words in my head like a bad song, a DNA test, or forget about inheriting anything. She really believed she could scream me out of my own father's will. The lake house looked exactly the same when I pulled up. Cedar siding, old grill on the deck, the wind coming off Lake Michigan hard enough to sting. Inside, it still smelled like coffee, motor oil, and the cheap pine cleaner Dad swore by. For a second I had to stand in the doorway and swallow the lump in my throat. Then I did what I do best. I went to work. I started in his office, the one room we all pretended didn't exist when he was alive. Bottom file cabinet drawer, behind a stack of boring tax returns, I felt my fingers hit metal, a lockbox. The key was taped underneath his desk, exactly where a man who fixed his own appliances would hide it. Inside, there were birth certificates, an old marriage license, and a thin, yellowing envelope postmarked Seattle, 1990. The letter was from a man named Gavin Holt. He wrote that he hadn't known my mother was still married when they met at a tech conference, that there was a chance he was the father of the baby she was carrying, and that if her husband chose to raise that child as his own, he would step back and stay gone. He ended it with a line that made my skin prickle. "If your husband ever needs proof, he knows how to find me." I set the letter down and opened one of Dad's leather notebooks, the ones I'd always thought were work logs. They weren't. One entry, dated the same year, said he knew about the affair, that the timing didn't lie, and that biology didn't change the vow he'd made to raise every child under his roof. A later entry, from just a few months before he died, talked about me by name. He wrote that I was the one who showed up to fix the leaky sink, help replace drywall, take him to appointments, while my sister only called when her credit card was maxed or her lease was up. Then there was a line about updating his will, adding language in case the girls turn this into a blood test instead of a goodbye. I took photos of everything with my phone, letter, journal pages, sticky notes about the will, and dropped them into a new folder on my cloud drive labeled Estate. Evidence. In his desk, I found more. Tuition statements from a private university my sister went to, paid in full by Richard Turner. Down payment paperwork for her first townhouse. Thousands in credit card payments he'd quietly made on her behalf. For me, There were a few small checks to community college and some scribbled notes about how Grace insists on paying her own way. I should have felt bitter. Instead, what I felt was clarity. This wasn't about who Dad loved more. It was about who he trusted to handle the truth when it finally blew up. That night, I sent Arthur a short email. I found some documents that might matter if the DNA situation escalates. Let me know if you need them. No attachments, no explanations. I wasn't ready to hand everything over yet. After all, my sister wanted proof so badly she was willing to demand it at our father's funeral. I had a feeling she was about to drown in more proof than she ever bargained for. Mayo Clinic's satellite lab sat in one of those glass office parks that all look the same, all beige stone and mirrored windows. My sister's silver Mercedes was already parked out front when I pulled my Honda into a spot 3 rows back. She was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, sunglasses on like this was just another power meeting she was about to win. "You're late," she said as I walked up, even though I was 5 minutes early. "No," I said, holding up my phone with the appointment time. "I'm exactly on time. You're just eager." Her eyes dropped to my wrist, to the old stainless steel watch Dad had given me the Christmas before his first round of chemo. The same watch he'd once promised to pass down to his firstborn, and then never did. Her jaw tightened for half a second before she looked away. Inside, the lab smelled like antiseptic and printer ink. A nurse led us into a small room with 2 chairs and a metal tray, laid out with swabs and labeled vials. She explained the process like we were strangers off the street, not 2 women who'd just buried the same father. "We'll collect buccal swabs from both of you," she said, clipping paperwork to a board. "The samples will be compared to a reference profile from Mr. Turner. Results are typically available in 5 to 7 business days and will be sent to the attorney of record." My sister signed her section with this sharp, angry flourish, then sat back with her arms folded. "This is really for your sake," she said. "Once it's in writing, you can't play the victim when you get cut out." I looked at her, at the flawless makeup, the perfect blowout she'd probably gotten the morning of our dad's funeral. "You turned our dad's estate into a science experiment," I said. "Whatever happens next is on you." The swabbing itself took maybe 2 minutes. Open, swab, click. The nurse labeled each tube carefully. Subject A, Subject B, reference. When it was over, my sister grabbed her bag like she had a flight to catch. "You'll see," she said, pushing past me toward the door. "Dad and I were the same person. You were always something else." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Something else." I didn't bother walking out with her. I waited until I heard the Mercedes start and pull away. Then I went back to my car and drove to the nearest Starbucks. I ordered my usual, found a corner table, and opened my laptop. If she wanted this to be legal, it was going to be legal. I created a new folder called Turner Estate, Evidence, and started dropping in everything I'd found. Photos of the letter from Gavin Holt, scans of Dad's journal entries, screenshots of tuition payments, mortgage documents, credit card statements. Then I added one more thing, a note to myself that said, "She demanded the test. She chose the battlefield. All I'm doing is documenting the truth." 5 to 7 business days. That was all it would take for a lab report to blow up the story my sister had told herself her entire life. I didn't know exactly how the numbers would land yet, but for the first time since the funeral, I felt something that almost resembled calm. Whatever those results said, I was ready. Arthur Blake's office in downtown Chicago had the kind of view my dad used to joke he'd never afford, all glass and steel and lake in the distance. But that afternoon, nobody was looking out the windows. My mother sat on one side of the polished table twisting a tissue in her hands. I sat on the other, and my sister paced in heels that clicked like a metronome of pure irritation. She finally dropped into the chair next to me, crossing her legs like she owned the place. "Let's just get this over with," she said. Arthur cleared his throat, slid a manila envelope into the center of the table, and put on his glasses. "These," he said, tapping the envelope, "are the paternity test results comparing both of you to Mr. Turner's reference profile. Before I read them, I want to remind everyone that your father's will contains specific language about this scenario." My sister rolled her eyes. "We know. If she's not his, she doesn't get the house. That's why we're here." She said it like she was doing me some kind of favor. Arthur opened the envelope, unfolded the report, and read in the steady voice of a man who's watched families implode for a living. "Subject A, tested against the genetic profile of Richard Turner," he said. "Probability of biological relationship, 0%. The room went so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. My sister blinked, then let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Read it again." He didn't. He shifted his gaze to the next page. Subject B, tested against the genetic profile of Richard Turner. Probability of biological relationship, 99.9%. My mother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. My sister's face drained of color so fast it was like someone pulled a plug. "No," she whispered. "No, that's wrong. I look just like him." "She doesn't. There's no way." Arthur set the papers down, hands folded. "The lab is accredited and the chain of custody was properly followed," he said. "These results are conclusive. And under your father's updated will, in the event of any paternity dispute, the verified biological child receives the lake property, investment accounts, and remaining cash. The other child receives a fixed cash bequest and any personal items specifically mentioned by name." My sister snapped her head toward me. "You knew," she said, voice shaking, eyes blazing. "You knew you were his. You set me up. You dug through his stuff and found something and you didn't say a word." I kept my eyes on her, feeling that same cold calm I'd had when I signed the form. "You screamed in my face at Dad's funeral and demanded a DNA test," I said. "You shoved the consent form at me and told me to sign it or forget about inheriting anything. You chose this. I just let the truth show up on paper." My mother burst into full-on tears then, covering her face with both hands. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "Grace, I'm so sorry. Richard found out about someone else, years ago. I thought it was over. I thought it didn't matter because he said it didn't matter. He said he would raise both of you as his own, that blood didn't change the promises he made. I never wanted this to come out like this." My sister pushed back her chair so hard it squealed. "You're telling me he's not my dad?" she yelled. "Now? After he's dead? After I spent my whole life being his?" Arthur slid a small sealed envelope across the table toward me. "Your father left this with his instructions," he said softly. "He asked that I give it to you if a paternity test was ever requested." My hands finally shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in my dad's blocky handwriting. He talked about how proud he was that I showed up when it counted, that I didn't measure love in checks or gifts, that if anyone ever turned his funeral into a DNA trial, it meant they had chosen greed over family. The last line read, "If you're reading this, Gracie, remember, you don't owe anyone your inheritance, your forgiveness, or your peace. Take what's yours and build a life that isn't chained to their mistakes." I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. My sister grabbed her bag, eyes bright with rage. "Enjoy the house," she spat. "Enjoy everything. You stole my life." She stormed out, the door slamming behind her. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was my mother's quiet sobbing and the hum of the city outside. I hadn't stolen anything. She'd forced a DNA test to cut me out of the inheritance. All I'd done was let it tell the truth. The day after the results meeting, I drove back up to the lake house alone. The key felt different in my hand now, heavier somehow, knowing the deed had my name on it, and only my name. The place was quiet in that way only a house built for a family can be when there's just one person standing in it. I dropped my bag in the kitchen, took a breath, and went straight back to Dad's office. If my sister was going to turn this into a war, I wasn't walking in unarmed. I pulled every box, every binder, every file out of the cabinets and spread them across the floor. There were more photo albums I hadn't seen the first day. In one from the early 90s, between a 4th of July cookout and a Christmas tree picture. There it was. A snapshot of my mom at a tech conference reception, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man wearing a name badge that clearly read Gavin Holt, Seattle. He had the same sharp jawline and eye shape my sister has. I stared at the picture until my vision blurred, then slipped it out of the plastic sleeve and set it aside. In another box, I found a plain manila envelope labeled Lindsay School and Wedding. Inside were tuition invoices from a private university, all stamped paid in my dad's handwriting. A breakdown of wedding costs with checks he'd written for the venue, the photographer, the open bar, and a folded letter from a company politely declining a job offer she'd wanted, with a sticky note from Dad across the top. You don't need this to know your worth. Love, R. There were no matching envelopes with my name on them, just a thin folder with community college receipts and a scribble in the margin. Grace insists on paying her own tuition. I spent hours scanning everything into my laptop with a cheap portable scanner Dad had kept for work. On my cloud drive, the Turner estate, evidence folder grew. Subfolders for education, housing, credit cards, photos, letters. I built a spreadsheet that would have made any auditor proud, listing dates, amounts, and notes. Dad covering overdrafts, paying off maxed-out cards, wiring money for emergencies that always lined up with vacations and shopping trips. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister, the first contact since she'd stormed out of Arthur's office. It was short and ugly. You haven't won. I'm not walking away from 37 years because of one piece of paper. My lawyer will be in touch. A minute later, my mom called. I let it go to voicemail, then played it on speaker. Her voice was thick from crying. Grace, please call me back. Your sister is not okay. She hasn't slept. She's sick to her stomach. Ethan is talking about leaving, and she keeps saying you stole everything. Maybe you could, I don't know, give up the house, split things, just so this doesn't destroy our family. I deleted the voicemail. Where was this energy when she watched my sister humiliate me in front of a casket and a lawyer? An hour after that, my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go, then answered. Grace, it's Ethan. My sister's husband sounded exhausted, like he'd been living on coffee and stress for weeks. He apologized for calling, then told me what I already suspected, that Lindsay had been living on credit for years, that Dad had bailed her out more times than he could count, that she'd built an entire identity around being Richard's favorite, and now that anchor was gone. She's spiraling, he said quietly. She's furious at you, but really she's scared. She doesn't know who she is without his money and that last name being simple. When I didn't respond, he sighed. Look, I'm not asking you to fix this. I just think you should know what you're up against. She's already talking about suing. The next morning, an email from a downtown law firm hit my inbox, attached to a PDF full of legal language and threats about equitable interests and 37 years of reliance. I read it all the way through, then opened my evidence folder and scrolled. My sister had chosen the battlefield the day she shoved that consent form in my face. What she still didn't understand was that I hadn't come to this fight empty-handed. Civil court in Chicago is a lot less glamorous than TV makes it look. No mahogany, No soaring ceilings, just beige walls, tired carpet, and a judge who had clearly seen every version of "my family is suing me over money" there was to see. I sat at the defendant's table in a black blazer that still smelled faintly like dry cleaner, my attorney beside me, a stack of organized binders at our feet. Across the aisle, Lindsay sat ramrod straight in a suit that was just a little too sharp for the occasion, her new attorney flipping through a folder like he was about to deliver a closing argument that would change his career. He started strong, I'll give him that. He talked about 37 years of reliance, about a little girl raised as Richard Turner's daughter, about birthday parties and bedtime stories, and how cutting her out of the estate based on a late-in-life paternity test was fundamentally unjust. He painted a picture of me as a cold strategist who had weaponized a technical truth to steal a legacy. When he finished, my attorney stood and quietly walked the court through the facts. A valid, updated will, signed when my dad was of sound mind. Clear language anticipating a paternity dispute. Accredited lab DNA results. Journal entries where my father explicitly mentioned the clause, and financial records showing a lifetime of support that my father had chosen to give my sister while he was alive. Mr. Turner was generous in life, my lawyer said, tapping one of the binders, and deliberate in death. He structured his estate so that no one could bully their way into or out of it after he was gone. The judge leafed through the will, the lab report, the highlighted sections of Dad's journal, then looked over his glasses at Lindsay's side of the room. "I understand this is emotionally painful," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. "But the law cares about documents and capacity, not hurt feelings." Mr. Turner anticipated this situation and made his wishes clear. The will stands. The petition is denied. The gavel came down with a dull thud that sounded, to me, like a full stop. To Lindsay, it sounded like something breaking. She didn't look at me as we filed out of the courtroom, but I saw her reflection in the glass doors on the way out. The perfect hair a little less perfect, the practiced confidence cracked. What the judge didn't see was everything that happened in the weeks after. The bank where she'd been a branch manager decided they didn't need the PR headache of an inheritance scandal and restructured her position right out of existence. Ethan followed through on the divorce papers he'd been threatening to file, splitting their remaining assets and walking away. The Mercedes went up for sale. The townhouse went on the market. By the time the ink dried on the court's decision, Lindsay was living in a much smaller apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place she used to sneer at when we drove past. Meanwhile, the lake house sold quicker than any of us expected. A young tech couple from the city put in an offer just under $2.4 million cash. Between that and the investment accounts and cash my dad had left, my total inheritance landed just shy of $2.9 million. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life outside of someone else's spreadsheet. Arthur walked me through the transfers, the taxes, the smart ways to not blow it all at once. I paid off my own modest debts, moved a big chunk into conservative investments, and started scrolling listings in Austin, the city I'd always daydreamed about when Chicago winters felt like punishment. A few weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of a small, sunlit bungalow with a realtor handing me keys and a folder of paperwork. "Most people need 30 years to own something like this," she said. "You're walking in with no mortgage. That's quite a position to be in." It was, and it wasn't. The house was bought with money that had cost me a father, a sister, and whatever version of family we'd pretended to be before the DNA test. That night, surrounded by boxes in a city where no one knew my last name, I opened my laptop and pulled up my banking app. The numbers stared back at me, solid and unreal at the same time. I thought about my dad's letter, about the judge's words, about my sister's face when the results were read. Then I opened a checkbook I'd barely used and wrote out a number that made my chest tighten. $150,000, payable to Lindsay Turner. In the memo line I wrote, "From Dad, because he loved you." I didn't tell her it was me. I didn't attach a note, didn't demand an apology in return. I mailed it to the last address I had for her and sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the little flag on the mailbox after I slid it in. My sister had tried to use a DNA test to cut me out of my own father's life. The test proved I was his. The court said the house and the money were mine, and the world watched her fall apart under the weight of her own choices. Sending that check didn't change any of that. It just made sure that when I finally closed this chapter, I could say the one thing she never could. I wasn't owned by the money. I didn't hear anything for weeks after I mailed that check. No angry calls, no gloating texts, no dramatic doorstep confrontation. Honestly, that silence was its own kind of peace. I settled into Austin one day at a time, learning the back roads, setting up a tiny home office, taking on freelance marketing clients for healthcare startups that didn't care about my last name, only my results. I planted a few herbs on the back porch, bought a used bike, and started waking up to sun instead of snow. For the first time in a long time, my life felt like it belonged entirely to me. Then one afternoon, an email popped up with a subject line that made my stomach flip, "From your sister." I almost closed my laptop. Curiosity won. The message was short, with a link to a private video. She didn't mention the money. She looked smaller on the screen than I remembered her, sitting at a cheap-looking kitchen table, hair pulled back, no full-face makeup, no armor. She told me she'd gotten a cashier's check in the mail with no return address, but she knew it was from me because, in her words, Dad never sent checks that big without a lecture. She said the money had cleared her worst debts and kept her from having to file bankruptcy, but that it didn't fix the part of her that had been ready to tear me apart over a house and some numbers on a page. She talked about starting therapy, about getting a job at a coffee shop because no bank in the city wanted to touch her until the gossip died down, about sitting in a studio apartment at night and realizing that the thing she'd been clinging to her whole life wasn't Dad himself. It was the story she'd told about being his favorite. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally, staring straight into the camera, eyes red. "You were right. I turned Dad's funeral into a trial because I couldn't stand the idea of not winning one last time. The DNA test didn't ruin my life. I did. You just refused to let me take you down with me." A few days later, my mom mailed a small box to my new address in Texas. Inside was an old photo album I'd never seen before, all pictures of just me and my dad. Me as a kid sitting on his shoulders at a baseball game, him teaching me how to change a tire in the driveway, the two of us covered in paint from the time we tried to redo the living room ourselves. Tucked into the back cover was a note in his handwriting that simply said, "You never needed proof on paper to be mine." I sat at my kitchen table in Austin, the way my sister had sat at hers, holding that note in one hand and my coffee in the other, and realized something that should have been obvious all along. The real inheritance my sister and I were fighting over wasn't the house or the bank accounts. It was the idea of who we were in our father's eyes. She thought love was a spotlight you had to keep dragging back to yourself. I thought love was showing up when things got hard. A DNA test can tell you who you're related to. It cannot tell you who actually acted like family. In the end, my sister didn't lose because of the lab report. She lost because every time she had to choose between greed and grace, she picked greed until there was nothing left but an empty apartment and a job that didn't impress anyone. And I didn't win because my name ended up on a deed. I won because I walked away with my values and my peace intact. People love to say blood is thicker than water, but here's what I learned the hard way. It's your choices, not your DNA, that decide what kind of family you really are. So if you ever find yourself standing in a room where someone you love is willing to put you on trial over money, ask yourself this: is proving you're right worth becoming just like them, Or is it better to let the truth speak for you and save the best parts of yourself for a life they can't touch?